Well, I went to the post office in 1938, October 1938, and then it was the newsagents and the post office and a grocery shop and lots of other things as well. We had the paraffin and lamp glasses and things, that was all outside in warehouses. And also the only telephone kiosk that there was in the village was behind the door at the post office. And the switchboard and the post office department was at that end of the shop. The grocery was at the other end, where the post office is now. And I just really liked the idea. Mr. Fisher came to see my mum and dad to see if I could go there to work when I left school at 14. And so we went down for an interview on the Sunday afternoon. And that was that, really. I started there on the Monday. And I was able to learn the switchboard, which I really did like. I enjoyed that very much. But then Mr. Fisher found out that I couldn't learn the post office until I was 16. And so he really put me in charge of the grocery end at the other end. And I had used to go up to the post office occasionally to help empty the letterbox and sort up the letters, because it was all hand-stamped then. And I was brought into the post office very gradually, really. I had that 2 years, and I enjoyed that. And I learned the newspaper trade, and I helped with all general things. And we had got such a range of goods to sell. Material by the yard, and we sold wools of every kind. And then we had boots and shoes, and...
I can hear a noise.
Was it birds?
Is it Michael upstairs?
To me about when you started work. You
Yes.
started work during the war, so if you tell us that.
Well, I went to the post office in 1938, October 1938, and then it was the newsagents and the post office and a grocery shop and lots of other things as well. We had the paraffin and lamp glasses and things, that was all outside in warehouses. And also the only telephone kiosk that there was in the village was behind the door at the post office. And the switchboard and the post office department was at that end of the shop. The grocery was at the other end, where the post office is now. And I just really liked the idea. Mr. Fisher came to see my mum and dad to see if I could go there to work when I left school at 14. And so we went down for an interview on the Sunday afternoon. And that was that, really. I started there on the Monday. And I was able to learn the switchboard, which I really did like. I enjoyed that very much. But then Mr. Fisher found out that I couldn't learn the post office until I was 16. And so he really put me in charge of the grocery end at the other end. And I had used to go up to the post office occasionally to help empty the letterbox and sort up the letters, because it was all hand-stamped then. And I was brought into the post office very gradually, really. I had that 2 years, and I enjoyed that. And I learned the newspaper trade, and I helped with all general things. And we had got such a range of goods to sell. Material by the yard, and we sold wools of every kind. And then we had boots and shoes, and...
I can hear a noise.
Was it birds?
Is it Michael upstairs?
Couldn't you? I mean, we're not filming it. Why couldn't you?
Learn the post office?
Yeah.
Because I wasn't 16. I had to wait for that 2 years until I was 16 because I had to sign secrecy papers. Because you did not. You had to realise that you must not divulge anything that you saw and heard in the post office.
Yeah. So because of that noise, we'll start again if you don't mind. Do you mind?
Okay. No. I don't know if I can.
Well, no. You don't have to say exactly the same thing. No, because this is totally different. This is
So it's back to the beginning.
As though we've not done anything.
From when I went to the post office.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, so tell me.
Do you want me to see if it is Michael? Or...
Couldn't you? I mean, we're not filming it. Why couldn't you?
Learn the post office?
Yeah.
Because I wasn't 16. I had to wait for that 2 years until I was 16 because I had to sign secrecy papers. Because you did not. You had to realise that you must not divulge anything that you saw and heard in the post office.
Yeah. So because of that noise, we'll start again if you don't mind. Do you mind?
Okay. No. I don't know if I can.
Well, no. You don't have to say exactly the same thing. No, because this is totally different. This is
so it's back to the beginning.
As though we've not done anything.
From when I went to the post office.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, so tell me.
Do you want me to see if it is Michael? Or...
Okay.
I went to the post office in 1938, October 1938. Mr. Fisher came down to see my mum and dad on the Sunday afternoon and to ask if they would be willing for me to work there after I'd left school. And we went down for the interview and I liked the idea because the telephone kiosk then was behind the door and the post office shop part was at that end of the shop. The grocery part was at where the post office is now. And I learned a bit of the
Okay.
I went to the post office in 1938, October 1938. Mr. Fisher came down to see my mum and dad on the Sunday afternoon and to ask if they would be willing for me to work there after I'd left school. And we went down for the interview and I liked the idea because the telephone kiosk then was behind the door and the post office shop part was at that end of the shop. The grocery part was at where the post office is now. And I learned a bit of the exchange. I'm getting mixed up here.
It's all right. Do you want to start again?
And
Do you want to start again?
I think I'll have to do it.
Yeah, that's
Whenever you're ready.
Don't worry about that.
Okay. Right from the beginning.
Yeah.
Yes. I went to the post office in October 1938 when I was 14 and I was to learn the post office, but then Mr. Fisher found out that I couldn't learn post office until I was 16. And he found this out because he had to apply for the secrecy papers, because if you worked in the post office you must not ever divulge anything that you saw and heard in the post office. And that was when he realised that I couldn't learn it until I was 16. And so I had a full 2 years working in the shop and learning the newspapers and what had to be done there. But I was also allowed, very occasionally, to have a go on the switchboard, just at different intervals, and see how I got on with it. And the only kiosk that was in the village then was behind the door at the post office. And as I said, the post office was at that end of the shop by the letterbox. And I was Oh, excuse me. And I was also allowed to empty the letterbox and help sort up the letters and date stamp, which was all very interesting. I loved it. And, and then we had the telegrams, and I was the telegram girl, really. Sometimes I had to go up to the aerodrome 5 or 6 times a day with telegrams. And as the servicemen all got up there, it was a lot more than ever. And had some interesting experiences really up there at times, because there was that much building work going on. Sometimes my bicycle had to be lifted over the trenches and put me on the straight and narrow again. But I chalked it all up to experience, really. And then we just sold everything at that point. We had paraffin outside, and there were the lamp glasses, because some of the cottages in the village were had still only got lamps for their lighting. And Mr. Fisher used to give me a box of matches when somebody came for a lot of paraffin, say 10 gallons, something like that. He used to give me a box of matches, so that every half gallon I measured out, I put a match on one side to help me keep count of how much was in this canister. It was quite a game, really. And there was so much going on. At one point as well, we sold mixed corn for people who had got the pigeons and the chickens and the hens in the backyard. And it was so busy, so many lines. We sold pottery, we sold boots and shoes, men's caps, Wellington boots, mops and buckets and brushes. Wherever there was a space, we put something behind the doors or anywhere. And for the boots and shoes, we had a huge catalogue. It was a big red catalogue, and you could come into the shop in the morning by 9 o'clock, choose your shoes, and we would ring up, Mr. Fisher would ring up Kettering, and they came down on the 3:19 train that afternoon, and I went down to the station and collected these parcels. And then on every Thursday, we had sausages and pies and polony, black pudding, all that kind of thing, on the train again from Tipton, from Palethorpes. And I again used to go on my bike and obviously walk back with it, with this big box. And all very interesting. There was something going on the whole time.
And there were things hanging up.
We used to sell underwear, ladies' underwear, and that we had rods across the ceiling, and Mr. Fisher used to call it silkies for spring. So one side of the shop we had these silkies for spring, and on the other side we'd got sides of bacon and hams hanging up for our grocery pot. And it really was all so interesting. I was very happy there, in as much as I didn't ever leave until after I was married, and then I did have a 10-year break, during which time I had 2 children, my 2 daughters. But then Mr. Fisher came and asked me if I would like to go back, because the lady that I trained to take my place was getting married, and he said, did I want to go back? My youngest daughter then was just starting school, and so I decided to go back. And I stayed there then for, I don't know how long.
So tell me about your working hours.
Yes, I used to start work at 8 o'clock in the morning, but because I was 14, that was something else that came to light, I couldn't work right through. So I used to go home at 11:30 until 1:30. I had to have that 2-hour break. And then I went back and I used to do some tidying up while we were still closed, and I could get ready for the afternoon, everything that went on. And also while Mr. Fisher had his lunch. But also the telephone had to be, somebody had to be there to answer the telephone anyway. And as the aerodrome progressed, it just got busier and busier, that did, because to begin with, the aerodrome had not got any landlines, and so all their communication came through us, and I had to deliver it up there. And it was just a case of sorting myself out up there. But I did go right from when it was one little hut, and so I knew what was going on really from the word go. It was, as I say, all very interesting and part and parcel of me growing up. I can't remember what else I told you.
Well, it's all right. I'll prompt you. Can you change the?
Whenever you're ready.
Don't worry about that.
Okay, right from the beginning.
Yeah.
Yes. I went to the post office in October 1938 when I was 14, and I was to learn the post office, but then Mr. Fisher found out that I couldn't learn post office until I was 16. And he found this out because he had to apply for the secrecy papers, because if you worked in the post office you must not ever divulge anything that you saw and heard in the post office. And that was when he realised that I couldn't learn it until I was 16. And so I had a full 2 years working in the shop and learning the newspapers and what had to be done there. But I was also allowed, very occasionally, to have a go on the switchboard, just at different intervals, and see how I got on with it. And the only kiosk that was in the village then was behind the door at the post office. And as I said, the post office was at that end of the shop by the letterbox. And I was also, and I was also allowed to empty the letterbox and help sort up the letters and date stamp, which was all very interesting. I loved it. And then we had the telegrams, and I was the telegram girl, really. Sometimes I had to go up to the aerodrome 5 or 6 times a day with telegrams.
Okay.
So, Betty, tell me again about the hours that you work.
I started work at 8 o'clock, and then Mr. Fisher found out that I couldn't work until 7 at night, and with just an hour's lunch break. And so I went home at 11:30 until 1:30, had that 2 hours off. And then we worked until 7 o'clock, but we were closed at 6 o'clock. But all the tidying up and preparing for the newspapers next morning, putting up the trestling for that, we were busy in that hour that we were closed. It was a very busy hour from 6 o'clock until 7. And but then it was all ready for morning. And there was also the last collection of the mail was at 5 minutes to 7, so we did have to be there for the mailman coming and to give him everything that he had to sign for as well. And the early morning mail, I wasn't involved in that, not then, but it came at 6 o'clock in the morning. Mr. Fisher always had to be up 5 o'clock to get the letters all stamped up and prepared for the mailman. But then when I did the living in for them while they had a holiday, once I once I was qualified to do all this, I used to do all this, and we lived in at the post office, and I did that for them even when I had got my eldest daughter. She used to come with me, and she quite enjoyed herself.
Could you explain to us that it would? I mean, it's different now, isn't it? Because it was a sorting office.
It
So
isn't
could you-
it isn't a mail office now.
No. So could you explain? I mean, people won't know that it was a sorting
Yeah.
office and what happened.
At that time, we were a full mail office, and we had 2 deliveries every day, and we had 3 post people working for us, for the post office, and there again, the postman that we had, Mr. Statham, was very kind to Mrs. Mason and myself throughout the war years, because we had the vinegar barrels to tap, and he used to say, "Now you young girls, you don't get doing that. I'll bring that barrel round for you and do that." And he was very, very kind to us and helped us a lot. And he used to do the delivery to Orgreave and Fradley Junction. And in the snowy weather, it really was a picture, because we had real winters then, and he used to go and hire Mr. Malabar's horse, a beautiful big grey, and Mr. Statham in his navy blue uniform. It really was such a picture. I'm sure somewhere Mr. Fisher had got pictures of that. It was really lovely. And he used to go up to Orgreave and the junction on his horse. It was very traumatic, really. It was quite exciting. And sometimes in the deep snow, it was a real picture.
Yeah.
Right. During my 2 years that I couldn't really learn post office, Mr. Fisher showed me how to bone the bacon and to tap the vinegar barrels. And for a 14-year-old, it was quite something, really. I didn't know if I could cope with it, but I did, and had a lot of help from Mrs. Mason. She was a bit older than me, and there again, she was very good, because if there were telegrams at night for the camp, for the aerodrome, she would come with me, and I didn't ever go up there at night on my own. If there was nobody else, my dad came with me. And what else did I do?
How many times going up and down to the aerodrome? How many times a day would you be doing that?
6. I used to, as the aerodrome progressed, the telegrams came thick and fast, and it was nothing at all for me to have to go up and down there six times a day. There's my good exercise on my bike. And I was still sorting myself out with all these different firms, because it was still being built long after the armed forces had arrived. And I knew exactly where to find the officers' training unit. I knew just where to find the batman for the officers' quarters. And there was one, the cook there, he was very kind. He was a bit older man, and he used to say, "Now what have you got today?" And I used to say, "It's for Captain so-and-so," and he'd say, "Do you want to leave it with me?" I say, "Yes, please." And he would look after it for me and see that the gentleman got his telegram. And a lot of this, by this time I was learning the switchboard, and a lot of these telegrams were in code, because, as I say, they hadn't got any landlines at that time up there, so their telegrams and their messages were all via our post office. Fradley wasn't that kind of an office, so it couldn't be transferred to there.
I've got another note here that says 9 miles each way to Shenstone.
Yes, it was my. I would have loved to have learned to do switchboard work. I would have liked to have been a telephonist. That really appealed to me. But my my brother was working by that time at Shenstone at the AID, and my mum just wouldn't have anybody else travelling anywhere if she could help it during the war, because there were times when if he went on the train, he was just in Trent Valley Station most of the night. And she said she couldn't go through that anxiety with two of us. So that I just had to forget that. But prior to that, George, he biked. He went up to Shenstone from when he was 14. And to Shenstone, that was 9 miles each way. And but then eventually he went into the Air Force. He was aircrew.
Right.
To begin with, he started his training for that in the village at the ATC with Mr. McKnight. And then he had to go to Birmingham Classification Centre.
Okay, let's just pause for a minute.
Yeah.
Are you okay? We're still
Yeah.
on the same size shot? Or?
I've just changed slightly, gone
Yeah.
in a bit.
Yeah. So can you explain that to us and what you did instead?
During the war, of course, there wasn't any proper wrapping paper, and people used to bring their baskets and a plate and a snowy white cloth to cover their meats and sausages, and my mother did the same thing, going to the butcher's for your rations. And it's, when we look back, it's all very strange now, the amount of wrapping that there is, but there just wasn't, not then. It's I can't think.
That's all right. That's fine. Fine. And saving certificates, I've got a note there as well.
We also, during the war, we had these special weeks. Sometimes it was called Dig for Victory, sometimes it was Wings for Victory, and it was where you really put your money into your local, and so that was us, the post office, and we had to order lots and lots of, thousands of pounds really of savings certificates, and then people really just moved their money around so that it went on to our target for that particular week. This is really where Nellie would have come in as, because she dealt with more of that than I did. But
Yeah, when you say target, the post office had a
Well, it was-
target to achieve.
yes, not especially the post office. It was the whole community. Like it was a war effort.
And so the community would have a target.
Yes, they used to put up a pole somewhere where the chemist is now, by the George and Dragon, and they moved the target up with every, however much we could say that we had dealt with during that week. And yes, it was just to encourage people to put money into the war effort.
Right, lovely. Okay, we'll sort of widen out now from the
Also during the war, of course, there was the blackout it was very, very difficult on my night trips up to the aerodrome or anywhere really, Witchner and all the places around, when you hadn't got any lights on your bicycle. You just relied purely on common sense and what you already knew. And because it really was so black, and all the windows, you hadn't got a window light or anything, and from anywhere, it was very difficult getting around at night. But on the brighter side, we had dances in the village hall, and of course, as the aerodrome progressed, it was great because we had all the airmen and the soldiers all came down, and basically that's where we young people learned to dance, because they were all a little bit older than us, and well, than me anyway. And also we had what we called a bob hop on a Saturday, what is now the Scout Hut, but then it was the Working Men's Club, and we used to take our own records and dance and learn to dance there, and that was our pleasure those days, because if you went into town and you went to the cinema, often it flashed up on the screen, the air raid sirens have gone. If you wish to leave, you must go now and find a shelter. But often we just sat where we were, really. Took our chances if we were in the cinema.
Could you just stop for a minute?
Sure.
Have a lemonade or an orange, something or other, and in the outdoor. And it was all just so innocent those days, because that's the only word you can find for it, isn't it? To what it is today.
We weren't running them.
I just got that little bit, but if we could just go
Could
over
you just
that.
tell us that again about
Sid,
yeah, and chaperoning and going to the
to the William.
outdoor at the Willie.
It was a gentleman named Sid Walker, and he was so good with we youngsters. He just stood there and watched that we were all behaving ourselves and not getting up to any mischief. And the most we did really in that respect was to run next door to the William IV, to the outdoor, and buy a lemonade or an orange squash or something like that, and then go back. And we just took our own records, and they were played on a radiogram. It was that was our Saturday night out. It was.
Hey, just stop for a minute. You mentioned that you sold silk stockings, did you? And that people wouldn't have nylon. There were no nylons. No, there was, well, I mean there were, but only.
There were,
if you got them
but
from
that was
Americans.
the Americans were bringing.
But women sanded their legs, didn't they?
Yes, they sort of painted their legs. Yes, a liquid. I don't know much about that
Oh, right,
because
right.
I just never used it.
We won't do that then.
No, I can't do that one really. Because I didn't ever do that anyway.
Right.
You have to remember, I still was only a kid.
Yeah.
What was I when the
No, but I didn't quite understand it. It was about light saving. What was that? Light saving. No.
light?
I won't be able to find it. Oh, hang on. Here we go.
Keepers.
Light.
The light keepers. That belonged to that.
Oh, right.
It was a we were dressed like sailors, but we wore a pleated skirt, and it was called the light keepers. and we used to gather once a week at Mrs. Aldridge's. That was the first house on Wellfield Road. I don't know who lives there now, but you know where Ron Chapman lived? At the house next door there. And she used to run it from there. And it was, we used to have round our cap HMS Indefatigable. And it was a proper sailor's hat. And for every function, my mum used to take mine to pieces, and my friends, and starch it and put it all back with all this padding. And we were very smart, navy blue and white, just like the sailors. We used to call ourselves the sailors, actually. And there was a troop in Burton who were the same, but they wore white trousers and the navy blue big collar. But we didn't. We wore the big. We had the big collar and proper uniform. We thought we were very smart. But there must be photographs somewhere, like probably at the War Memorial for November the 11th, for the armistice service. That was when we paraded, and our wreath was always like an anchor, and two of us carried it. We always felt that was quite an honour when we were picked to carry the anchor. And then there was the Girls' Friendly Society as well. That was held at what was the church house. I don't know what goes on there now, if anything. But we used to gather there as well. And with Mrs. Aldridge and Mrs. Stubbs, the school teacher's wife she was then.
Where was the church house?
Right opposite the mill stream. Yes. It was attached to the old vicarage. And it was beautiful, big room. But I think during the war, a lot of the old vicarage was turned into flats. The then vicar that was here, they turned it into flats. And in fact, the padre for the aerodrome lived there. And he helped me out one night on the camp, because I'd got a telegram for an officer and he wanted to know how I had got onto the camp without a pass. And I just had to say, well, I've got a telegram. And then the padre appeared behind him and he just said, "Oh, good evening, Betty." And the officer said, "Do you know this young lady?" And he said, "Oh, yes." He said, "I see her most days. She works in the post office where I live." Oh, that was all right. But after that, I was well and truly stopped at the Century when I went up to the camp next time, and I had got to be escorted to the guard room to have a pass made. But Mrs. Fisher, who was in charge by then, because Mr. Fisher had gone into the Air Force himself, and she said, "No, Betty, you don't have to do that because your telegram will admit you anywhere." She said, "So stand your ground." And I did. And after that, I did only have to deliver to the Century, the airman who was on guard. And so I didn't have to go all over the camp after that. But that bit was quite an experience that night.
Well, we're rolling.
Yeah.
Good.
Did you want that bit?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was good stuff.
It's lovely. Lovely. Well, is there anything else you can think of? I've gone through my notes.
What else did we do? Have you had a word with Avis about the GTC?
Yeah. Yeah. I will go and see her eventually.
Oh, right. What else did we do? We did only have 3 buses a day through the village. And the last one was 7:45 at night. So on our half day, we used to catch the 2:15 bus and go to the cinema, and we used to perhaps go and get our hair done and get back on the 7:45 bus at night. You had no other. There was a later train just after 9 o'clock. But then again, if it was the winter months, you were well and truly in the dark. And so we used to get home as soon as we could, really.
Was that from Lichfield?
No, Burton. There wasn't very much doing at all in Lichfield then. But yes, it was. But we were fortunate here, weren't we, really? You know, considering we'd got the aerodrome, I mean, there was an attempt to bomb it the once, but it missed the drome, and the bombs dropped at the top of Daisy Lane. But
Do you remember whether there were evacuees to the school or anything like
oh
that?
yes, we had a lot of evacuees, Birmingham children, a lot of children, yes, from Birmingham. Mrs. Fisher had 3 little boys, but they just couldn't settle. They were very unhappy, and they went back home. But there was some who just stayed on, and there was one little boy, Robert, his name was, who was with Mrs. Elson, and his mum was killed in an air raid, and he just stayed with Mrs. Elson after the war. And there was a little girl down Post Office Road as well. And again, she was with an elderly lady, Mrs. Asprey she was with, and she didn't ever let go. She still kept coming back to see Mrs. Asprey as well. But some were very, very upset. Oh, there was a lot of tears. I felt very traumatic for children. Well, and for parents as well too. But however, it had to be.
Just stop for a bit.
Sure, yeah.
1943, and once she was on her feet and a chatty little girl, she used to say, "Can I come now, Betty?" or "Can I come now, Nellie?" And she used to come to us, and we read her a story from one of the comics that were there on the shelf. And she was a big part of our lives there as well at that time. This was Anne.
It did really sell everything, didn't it?
Absolutely everything. The counter, you see, was the big oak counter, and it had massive drawers underneath, and we had the brass tape measure on the counter. And well, if it wasn't on show, it was probably in a drawer. And so we had like your pins and needles, knitting needles, along with the wool, and you could come and choose your wool, and then for whatever your pattern. That was another thing. We'd got all these piles of patterns as well, but then you could have your wool reserved to finish your garment and fetch it as you could afford it, really, those days.
So it was the hobby.
And we also sold silk stockings, 3 knots they were called, which those days were supposed to be the one to have if you could afford them. They were about 2 and 11 pence a pair. I can remember that. And they were in a box. Were boxed for 2 and 11 pence.
It was the hub of the village then, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
So was it any bigger inside than it is now?
No,
It wasn't.
don't know
It's
where
time,
we
is
put it.
Incredible.
Because, I was in there last week and I looked around and I thought, so where did we put everything? I thought, behind the door it was the kiosk, and then there was a petition to separate the post office from the counter. But then I looked, and the post office part now is much, much bigger than ever we had to work in then. We'd only got a little passage bit to the letterbox, and that, as I say, all the groceries were down at the other end. But we sold, another thing we sold was black treacle. And people used to bring their jar, and we weighed the jar and then filled it with the black treacle. And that's how we got the cost of it. And snuff, we sold snuff, that along with all the cigarettes, and not packets of snuff, it was loose. Very interesting, really.
Mm.
You okay with that, or do you have to?
I am.
The little chemist shop that we had was within Pear Tree Cottage. Has anybody told you that? Mm. And it belonged to Mrs. Parton. And she also used to keep Angora rabbits. And she'd got her own spinning wheel, and she used to spin the wool from her rabbits and she used to make beautiful boleros and cardigans and things for people. That was like a cottage industry. And she also had this little chemist shop. She didn't do dispensing and things like that, but she'd got all your medications that you could buy over the counter. And the co-op those days was at the top of the village. Where is it? The software shop now. That used to be the co-op.
Which is Pear Tree Cottage?
Opposite the George.
Right next to the post office,
Oh, right, the big house.
Mm.
I mean, oh,
Mm.
right, okay.
where the Howard Smiths lived.
Right.
Do you remember the Howard Smith?
No, I might not remember the face without the name.
Mm.
Hopeless on names. Right,
We're still going.
okay. Yeah.
Let's go on to Hearts. You told me something interesting about Hearts.
Mr. Fisher used to tell me that the Hart family were direct descendants of Shakespeare. He was quite certain that they were. I think that the Harts themselves had told him this. Yeah, and they kept it was a garage where the hairdressers is now, where Carol's the hairdressers is. That was Hart's shop, and they sold lots and lots of things. Everything for your bike and your car accessories, and there was also petrol pumps to start with there. But I don't know, they weren't going very long there. We also had 2 fish and chip shops in the village. One was it was Mrs. Bailey's, and that was round the back. You went round the back of the house, and beautiful shop that was. And the other one was where the electrics shop is now. That was a fish and chip shop, and we were very well catered for, really. We had Mrs. Wright's, the drapery shop. That's been knocked down by the butchers, by Coates's.
Do you remember rationing then?
The rationing. Wasn't very much of it, was there?
Can you remember anything about it? Can you remember what you got or what you
I
didn't
ought
get?
to do really because I had to deal with it. I can just remember the little box with the butter coming that fortnightly, and we had to really cut it up to people's 2 ounces or whatever. And then we did find, I don't know quite what we did with that, because we must have found a bit of greaseproof paper or something for that. I just can't think. Must have done.
Okay, shall we have a rest?
I just used to address them to Marshals of Nottingham. That was all I had to put on it. And we had all the sepia. They were the sepia photographs. And sold them in the shop. And yes, we just sold everything.
What were the photographs of?
The village.
Oh, of the village.
Because the long bridge,
Yeah.
Mr. Fisher named that the pier.
The pier, that's so.
The pier Omnibus, that was definitely Mr. Fisher's.
We've seen that postcard, haven't we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Have you seen one of the Paul Pry? I just can't. It's such a shame because it was a landmark here. It was a beautiful hotel.
There are some up in the post office still, aren't there, for sale? Pictures of the Paul Pryor.
No, right, yes. Yes, they really do need preserving, they do. Mm-hmm. And then there's the alley as well, down to Walkfield. And there was one where Mr. Fisher's dog lay at the top of there, and he liked something to focus and to feature. Because when Carl, his dog, when that died, and we had got a collie, this was later, much later on, and he said, I'm going to have your Monty on it next, he said, because I've got to have a dog on. But we never got around to that one. But he would say, can you manage for a little while now? He said, the sun's just right, so I'll pop out and get a few snaps. And he used to vanish, and off he'd go with his camera and to take some new photographs.
So you said it was plate. So was it? Did he have a big camera?
Mm.
That used to put
And the tripod, yeah.
cloth over his head.
Yes, yeah. Yeah.
So there would have been glass plates, probably. Wouldn't
Yes,
there
there were, yeah. Because we had to pack them into pieces of wood.
I bet. Wow, it's
You
a lot
know,
different now, isn't it?
Pardon?
It's a lot different now. You just stick a little
Yes,
plastic card in.
that's right, yes, yeah. And then, as I say, he'd got his dark room, this little bedroom at the post office. And so, yes, Diane might like to, let you see things like that. Mm. But it's the warehouses, but that, you see, the one lady who went to the post office, she turned that into the sorting office where, and the other one where the paraffin was, where the big tank was for the paraffin, I think they turned that into the garage. And then this other one, that was turned into the sorting office. But of course it was an improvement, really, to get the mail that's, outside. Because when I was there to start with, it was all in the shop. Christmas, you didn't know where to put your feet, coming past all the packages and parcels and.
It's difficult to imagine, isn't it?
It is. It really is. I can see them now.
You get
All up the whole of the length of the shop, getting near to Christmas. Because people did post everything then. It was only at the cost that people put your cards and things through your own letterbox. They were all posted those days.
So people would post them to other people in the village.
Oh yes, and with having 2 deliveries, people could come to you and say, oh, "Could that go this afternoon? It's the birthday today." Yes, no problem. And it wasn't, because there was a delivery. So as long as the stamp was on it and we had cancelled the stamp, yes, it could be delivered. And you could take it in that morning.